Hi class, and welcome to this video for VCE Year 12 Economics, which is going to cover the topic of the circular flow model of income. Now this is part of our Unit 3 study design for Outcome 2. Now by the end of this video, I hope that you really understand what we mean by the circular flow model of income, which is a relatively complex model which shows the flow of income through households, businesses, government, financial institutions, and the external sector. It's essentially an understanding of how income flows through a contemporary macroeconomy. This is our third key knowledge point for Outcome 2, and let's get started. So what is the circular flow model? I thought it might be good to start off with actually showing you the model. This is a representation of it. And you might be looking at it and going, well, that looks complicated. So we're going to come back to this or look at it, but this is showing the model in its entirety. I like this diagram. If you're from my class, in our textbook, it is shown like so. What is the circular flow model? It is a model that shows the flow of money, resources, and goods and services in an economy. We know there's lots of different entities in an economy, lots of flow of money, resources, goods and services between them, and this is trying to show it in a diagram or a model how this operates, how all these parts of the economy interact between each other. So as we said, and let's just recover it because I think it's important. The circular flow model, I've abbreviated there, is a model that shows the flow of money, cash, resources, and goods and services in an economy. At its core, it's showing how households and businesses interact. Essentially, probably, I guess, the two biggest parties of an economy, businesses and the people. The model shows that there are actually 4 separate flows between households and businesses. We're going to go through those 4 flows. What's important to understand is that they are continuous, they keep flowing, and interdependent. One flow affects the other. So this is something that is always happening in an economy and they are interacting with each other. What are the flows? It's important to probably categorize that 2 of these flows go from households to businesses. So money, resources, and goods or services are going from households to businesses. And 2 flows go in the other direction, businesses to households. And let's go through these flows in a summary on this slide and then each one in a bit more detail. Here are the 4 flows. The first flow of money, resources, and goods and services is that households, individuals, provide the resources, land, labour, and capital to businesses. Businesses don't operate without resources. Households are the ones that give them land, labour, and capital. The second flow is that businesses use those resources and hence they pay the households in return for these resources. What do households get paid? Income. So we might start to think of this is our flow from households to businesses. This one is from businesses to households as our businesses pay the households income. Flow 3, households demand goods and services. So with this income that they've just received, households demand goods and services, so they spend money and consume goods or services. This one is households, again, to businesses demanding goods or services. What do businesses do in flow 4? They provide the household with this production. So businesses provide the production to households. So to summarize before we go there in a bit more detail, flow 1, households provide the resources. This is given to businesses. Flow 2, the businesses use the resources and reward the household by paying them income. Flow 3, with that income, households demand goods or services. They spend money because they want to consume things. And flow 4, the businesses provide the finished products for the households to consume. Hopefully a relatively logical flow. Here, if we take a pause, and I encourage you to have a pause and have a look at this model. Now let's go through each flow in a bit more detail. Flow 1 is where the factors of production, resources, flow from households to businesses. So here is my household sector. Flow 1 is here, and there is a flow of natural, capital, and labour resources all the way to my business sector. So the household sector supplies or makes available the natural, labour, and capital resources for use by the business. They're going to use them to convert them into finished goods and services, which is a later flow. Now, people are obviously free to provide their labour. This probably makes sense. But we also want to understand that the other factors of production, the land and capital, is also provided by household because they're owned by the private individuals. So the first flow, resources from households to businesses. Flow 2, the businesses pay income to those individuals or household which provide them with the factors of production. Remember, factors of production is another term for the resources, land, capital, labour. So flow 2, which is coming from our businesses back to our household, there is a flow of income to owners selling their resources. So the market capitalist system rewards those who provide firms with factors of production. They are given income. What could that income be in the form of? Individuals selling labour, one of the factors of production, are paid wages, salaries, or commissions, depending on the job that you do. Individuals selling land or providing land are paid rent. And individuals selling capital are paid dividends, interest, and profits. Often they're investing in those businesses. So the money, something to understand is the money value of all the income paid to the households actually represents all of the resources actually sold. So all the money that went from households to businesses in flow 1 equals all the money and resources returned in flow 2. It probably makes sense. Then we come to flow 3. Flow 3 is where households demand goods or services. This represents the total value of all the types of demand for spending on Australian-made goods or services. And you can see it's here. And we're going to introduce you to a new term here called aggregate demand, which is quite complicated, and there is a separate video on that you can have a look at because it's a separate key knowledge point in outcome 2. This is called aggregate demand and is the total expenditure that households demand on final Australian-made goods or services. Now, aggregate demand has a formula. Aggregate demand equals C plus I plus G plus X minus M. Now you can see, and we're going to go through in this a lot more detail, but C is the flow of private consumption. So all the goods that households demand. The I is investment. G is government. And X is exports. So all of the demand on Australian-made goods or services comprises C, all the goods that households demand. I, all the goods that are demanded for investment. G, all the goods and services that governments spend money on. And X is exports, so all the goods or services that are demanded by overseas countries because we're sending it away. And we take away M, which is our imported spending. And you can see this is a little bit here. But for now, let's just focus on the fact that flow 3 is the demand for goods or services. Now, the demand of goods or services becomes a little bit complicated. If we think about all of the income that has come from flow 2, not all of that theoretically ends up being demand for goods or services. Some of this leaks out. Some of this is not used to demand for goods or services. In some cases, individuals save that money. So they save their income. This reduces their aggregate demand because you're not going to spend goods or services. Taxes also reduce aggregate demand because you can't spend money on goods or services that you must pay in taxes. And imports are when you use your income to buy goods from overseas. This reduces aggregate demand because aggregate demand is demand for Australian-made products. So these three are things that are going to mean that income is less than aggregate demand. However, there are three things that result in increases in aggregate demand, and we call them injections. Some of that saving goes into investment. So investments are going to increase your aggregate demand. So some of that saving you invest, try to get a return. Investments go to other demand for goods or services. Some of your taxes are used on government spending. Government spending demands goods or services from Australia, so that is going to increase aggregate demand. And exports is when overseas countries demand your goods or services. So that's quite complicated, but understanding that leakages do not have to be equal to injections and usually aren't. And if the injections of demand are less than your leakages, you've got more good leakages than injections, you're going to have less economic growth than potentially you could have. If the injections are greater than leakages, so you've got more demand than what is leaking out, you're going to have more economic growth than you thought you would. So that's quite complicated. Let's have a look a bit more at these leakages. Households, and potentially also look at a bit more this aggregate demand formula, which we will go into more detail in a separate video. Aggregate demand equals C, which is most household income is spent on the private consumption of goods. So aggregate demand is all of the final Australian demand. Sorry, all of the final demand for Australian goods and services. So some of that demand is comprised of household consumption as they spend their income on goods or services if made in Australia. The financial sector, some income is directed into household savings. These savings are leakages because they lower what is being consumed. But the financial sector injects back some of these savings because the savings go to banks, the financial sector, because the banks then lend it to private firms wanting it to expand their operations. And this is private investment spending. If businesses want to expand their operations, they're going to invest. This is going to lead to more demand for Australian goods or services because they expand by using Australian-made goods or services. The government sector, some income that households have is devoted to paying taxes. These are classed as a leakage because they lower the level of consumption in households. Now, some of that money taken out through tax action may enter the flow again if it's used by government spending. And overseas, some household income leaks out of the Australian economy as we spend money on imports. We are buying overseas goods. It might be some electronics from China, for example, or clothes made in another Italy or Bangladesh or something. And this is partially offset by us exporting some of our goods overseas. So in summary, and that's a bit complicated, the aggregate demand is the final demand for all Australian goods or services that are final. It comprises consumption by households, investments by the financial sector to expand businesses' operations, government spending, exports, and it is reduced by the imports. So flow 3 represents the total value of spending on Australian-made goods or services over a period of time. As we said, it is aggregate demand and consists of these inputs. The reason why we subtract M is that aggregate demand is to exclude spending on imported goods or services. So what only remains is the value of expenditure on Australian-made items. The level of aggregate demand is influenced by the total value of the leakages, savings, taxes, and imports, relative to the value of the injections, investment spending, government spending, exports. Now, if there was a rise in leakages relative to injections, aggregate demand would fall. Conversely, if there was a fall in leakages against a rise of injections, there'd be an increase in aggregate demand. So that's quite complicated. It's going to take a while to digest this concept. What's the fourth flow? A perhaps simple one. This is the production of the goods or services that are demanded. We represent this by gross domestic product. So flow 4 is the total value of goods or services actually produced by the business sector over a period of time. It reflects the overall level of the Australian economic activity, and we commonly call this gross domestic product or GDP. In the short term to medium term, the actual level of economic activity or gross domestic product is going to be dictated by how much the value of aggregate demand. So in the short term, aggregate demand is going to equal what your GDP is closely. Because what the society is demanding is what the business is going to produce, and that's the value that is produced. In the longer term, the supply of resources actually is going to be probably more important. And this is probably more about aggregate supply, which is a separate topic and separate videos to cover. So in other words, the overall level of economic activity is influenced by both aggregate demand and aggregate supply, and that is going to be the next couple of videos we go through. But in summary, let's recap a very complicated topic, or I think a complicated topic, the circular flow model of income. And what do we need to understand? We need to understand there are 4 flows. The first one being from households to businesses. The households provide resources. The second one being businesses provide a flow back to the household in terms of income. Then households demand goods or services, and we call this aggregate demand, and there is a complicated process to work that out. And the fourth process is businesses provide goods to, so we do production, and that is represented by your gross domestic product. Now, I hope that you've understood that. There's a lot of things flowing here. I encourage you to have a look back at that image that shows the flows and really think about this concept. It's one that's quite hard to get across in a PowerPoint, but it's about thinking this through, looking at that graph, understanding those flows. But I hope that that has helped you understand the circular flow model of income.